Our next speaker is Sarisht Wadhwa, who is a researcher at Duke University.
Good morning, everyone. I am Sarisht. Thanks for the invite to present our talk. Today, I'll be talking about AUCIL, which is an inclusion list design tailored for rational parties. So let's get started with an example in which there is a transaction star. Alice wants to add some collateral to a position that she has on the blockchain. Otherwise, she would get censored. Otherwise, she can get liquidated. And the adversary does not want this transaction to go through because if this collateral is not added to the position, then Alice can get liquidated and while it will make a lot of profit. And therefore, the adversary wants to censor the transaction. Alice's transaction, along with many other transactions, go into the mempool of the for the block builder. The block builder now has choices from this transactions, whichever transactions it wants to include in the block, and it can definitely remove transactions intentionally, whichever transactions it wants to. So the block producer has the means to censor the transaction. And what makes it worse is that the block builder space is heavily centralized right now. Three builders contribute to roughly 90% of the entire builder space. And that makes it easy for the adversary to bribe the block builders to exclude transactions. That is not the only reason for censorship. There can be more compliance reasons as well. But aside from that, this talk we'll be focusing more on the incentives side. So inclusion list has been touted as the solution for censorship resistance. The way it works is that inclusion list is a set of transactions that the block builder must include in the transaction in its slot. If the block does not contain a transaction, then it can make the block invalid and basically be forked out. This makes it really bad for the adversary because it cannot now easily bribe this builder. How bad does it get? That is actually dependent on the enforcement model of an inclusion list, which can be a conditional inclusion list, which is the regular inclusion lists that currently fossil, which, hey, today they went into a confirmed update for the next Ethereum update. So congrats to that. So in general, the transactions in inclusion list must appear if there is space in the block. If there is no space in the block, then the transactions can be excluded. Unconditional inclusion lists, however, do not allow that. Regardless of how many transactions there are in the block, the transactions that are included in the inclusion list must appear in the block. Otherwise, the block would be considered invalid. And AUCIL design is based on an unconditional inclusion list enforcement scheme, and that's what we'll be focusing on. Okay, so we saw that if an inclusion list exists and the transaction makes it into the inclusion list, the builder cannot censor it easily. The adversary cannot bribe to censor it easily. But what stops the adversary from also bribing whoever is creating this inclusion list into excluding the transaction from the inclusion list in the first place? This inclusion list mechanism itself needs to be a censorship-resistant mechanism. And there have been talks about that, and that is exactly what AUCIL is going to be working towards. The first point is who is going to be building this inclusion list? Should it be a single party, which can be again bribed? It is easy to reach. or should it be multiple parties, making it worse for the adversary? Should it be builders who are a centralized entity, or should it be validators who are relatively known to be a decentralized set of parties? And these are all rhetorical questions. Obviously, we want multiple validators. We want a multi-validator inclusion list protocol. And that is exactly what COMIS introduced, and it laid the groundwork for multi-validator inclusion list protocols. In a multi-validator inclusion list protocol, basically multiple validators try to collaboratively form the inclusion list. They select transactions from the mempool, and then they send it to an aggregation phase. The aggregation phase basically computes a union of all the transactions or all the inputs that the validators have given, and that forms the inclusion list. So how does this aggregation and input selection work? But before I talk more about AUCIL and how it answers these questions about how these inputs are selected and how the transactions are aggregated, we'll first formalize what the design goals for our protocols are. The first and foremost, the goal is that if all parties are rational, they should be incentivized to follow the protocol. In other words, there is some sort of an equilibrium that is established when parties are choosing their transactions, broadcasting, and whatever the aggregation does. Secondly, if some party is unable to participate because it crashes, let's say, then we should still be able to proceed forward and not and the inclusion list protocol should not stop. And lastly, it should make it as hard as possible for the adversary to bribe the parties, and which would make it robust against censorship. Before going to AUCIL, we will talk about FOSSIL, which again is the current design that is going to be incorporated. So FOSSIL produces a very simplistic design in which all validators select their inputs and select the entire mempool, so entire selection of mempool they have. Any valid transaction, they just contribute that to their input. They term this input as a local inclusion list, but we call it an input list because there are some differences in both of those terminologies. But for the context of the talk, I'll call it the input list. And then they send it to directly the builder or the proposer, who will aggregate them, all of these inputs by themselves, and produce this inclusion list to constrain themselves. They are, however, required to do so honestly because the attesters are verifying that this inclusion list is actually correctly formed. They confirm that the union of all inputs have been taken and the transactions in inclusion list are given the right space. However, what we see is that there is no current fee structure for FOSSIL. What this implies is that rational parties have no incentives. There is no fees that they are receiving to behave honestly. And they also rely on the trust of a majority of attesters, as well as relying on these attesters to actively scour through the mempool to basically compute the union on their own and participate in all the timings and computations that FOSSIL introduces. To their credit, if a single party is honest amongst the validators that they have, and the attesters are doing this work, then FOSSIL has really strong censorship resistance guarantees. Okay, so now moving on to our protocol, which is AUCIL. AUCIL is a design, a multi-validator inclusion list design, in which parties are selecting inputs, and I'll explain how these selections take place in the first place. And then these inputs are broadcast to the next phase, which is the aggregation phase. In the aggregation phase, each party computes a bid, which is basically the list of all the inputs that have previously been seen. Based on whoever has this highest bid, the builder has to basically compute a reverse auction, and whichever is the highest bid would constrain the builder. I'll go into it phase by phase, but before that, this design of ours allows AUCIL to, in fact, achieve censorship resistance, which is quadratically increasing in the fees that a transaction pays until the transaction, and it caps at around the validator time, number of validator times the fee paid. So until a scaling factor of number of validators is achieved, we have a quadratic increase in the bribe tolerated. Okay, so going into more details, into phase by phase selection, how do we first know which validators are selecting which transactions? Do we even need such a suggestion or some allocation problem in the first place? Well, if we do not give them what transactions they should choose, they'll naturally just select transactions based on a mixed Nash equilibrium, which is probabilistically choosing each transaction in order to maximize their utility in the expectation. However, this does leave utility that is uncollected. Basically, the adversary can come and tell the parties which transactions to include. Even if it is not trying to censor, it can increase the utility of each of these validators. More details on this can be found in a paper. Yeah. So what we suggest in AUCIL is to use a greedy selection round-robin based allocation for input selection. This achieves a correlated equilibrium where no party has actually any incentives to deviate from the transactions that have been suggested to it. The way it works is a greedy selection. We see that star is giving the highest utility to each party, so star is chosen. Then we update the utility that star is providing because now already one party or one instance of star has been chosen. And we repeat the greedy selection over and over again until we have the desired number of transactions or instances of transactions selected. Then, based on the final effective utility of each of these transactions, we sort and allocate them in a round-robin way to all the validators. What this ensures is that the utility received by each validator is as high as possible, and this achieves correlated equilibrium in which no party has incentives to deviate from the suggestion of algorithm. We can see that the red party over here is not suggested to include star, which is the highest paying effective transaction. But if it does select star and deviates from the protocol, it would only receive 10 utility, which is less than or equal to what it has already been allocated. So how does censorship resistance work in this phase? Well, if the adversary wants to stop star from getting into the inclusion list, it must bribe both the blue and the green parties to exclude this transaction. And it must bribe the full fee, which is 30 to both of these. And this is basically based on the multiplicity gadget assumptions, where if the fee paid is, let's say, the bribe paid is, let's say, 20, which is higher than the effective utility, then still probabilistically some party may deviate and choose to select the transaction. Moving on to the next phase, we have the aggregation phase, in which after the parties have selected their inputs, they'll broadcast that for the aggregation phase. And each party will compute a bid, which is, as I explained earlier, the list of inputs that it has received. The bid value, in fact, would be the number of lists that it receives and has computed in its bid. And whatever the highest bid is, will, and let's say it receives a utility of 30 in this case. So two things to note here. A party can choose or crash and not broadcast their selection in the first phase. This would mean that other parties now do not have this input to select, but the protocol still moves on. If the party crashes, we don't have any troubles. If this party again returns in the aggregation phase, we can still accept its bid in that phase and move on. However, if it does broadcast, there is no incentive for either of the parties, the blue or green, to drop this input from their bid, because it just reduces their bid and reduces the probability of winning the auction. So what exactly is preventing this red party from not broadcasting its input in the first place? Well, there is nothing in the current form of this aggregation. It can just choose not to broadcast, which is bad. To prevent this, what we add is the first thing we observe is that if they don't win, they will lose the fee as well, if for whatever reason they don't win. So we bias some parties won't win by adding another random number to the bid. So each party would compute a random number, a random bias that would add to their bid, and whichever party has the highest bid after computing this sum will be selected as the winner. Let's say the red party generates a bias of only 0.1, where the bias was in the range of 0 to 2, then the party is now not going to win, even though it withheld its input list from everyone else. So basically, all in all, the VRF value should be small enough that it does not impact the selection of inputs in the first place, because if we can just do a VRF which is infinitely large, then it doesn't matter if you're including inputs or not. So we don't want that to happen. We don't want it to be small enough that all parties now are incentivized to withhold their inputs. And so we come up with a number, a parameterization, which is square root times the number of parties in the system, is what we would want the bias to be, maximum bias to be. So based on this, if red party is still losing, then it might as well broadcast in order to save the 21 that it was receiving as fees from the inclusion list. And based on this bias, what we observe is that as long as a party generates a bias of less than 1, maximum bias minus 1, then it is always incentivized to broadcast. In this case, if the bias was only in the range of 0 to 2, every party who generates a bias value of less than 1 will be incentivized to broadcast. Whereas the parties within the range of 1 to 2 will follow some sort of a mixed Nash equilibrium, which is again shown in the paper. So basically, this means that every party would broadcast. The green party can choose not to, but if it does not, it doesn't impact the system. And as long as most parties broadcast, we achieve the censorship resistance properties that we were looking for in this phase. In fact, if the adversary now wants to bribe in this phase, it would have to bribe, and if it wants to remove star, it would have to remove 2 inputs from each of these parties. So it will have to bribe all 3 of these parties to remove the 2 instances of star that were being included. that is pretty bad in of itself. But let's say we use a world which is easier, and the adversary wants to only delete this triangle from the inclusion list and not star, which had two instances. In this case, again, the adversary would have to bribe those parties with a high enough VRF value that if it removes those, even if those parties reduce the bid, they're still higher than others. But that VRF value that I'm saying is known is actually not known to the adversary, and basically the adversary now has to bribe every party still in the system, and the censorship resistance properties remain the same even as long as if there is one instance of a transaction in any of the inputs. And the value of this bribe must be greater than the utility that we are providing for winning this auction phase, which is 30 to each parties. In fact, the censorship resistance value in this phase is much higher than what we achieve in phase one, which is where the quadratic increase and then the linear capping comes from. All in all, AUCIL, our protocol, has three properties that it achieves. The first is that it achieves an input selection equilibrium in which no party is incentivized to deviate from the selection of transactions. It achieves crash fault tolerance in which the protocol remains live with even up to theta crashes, and which can be controlled by the adversary or not. And lastly, it increases the cost to censor the transactions to really high in all phases, not the theoretically maximum yet. The theoretical maximum would be a linear scaling with respect to with a scaling factor of number of validators, but a high enough. So here's a link to our paper, and you can contact me at sarisht@wadhwa.edu. If you scan this, you will get the text as well. So yeah, contact me for any questions on any further. Yeah, thank you, and yeah.
All right, any questions?
Great talk. Great talk. I guess I got one question to do with the utility. So how do you envision, like, what do you envision the utility to be? Will that be, for example, like in an Ethereum transaction, you have a tip that's paid to the validator? Or will it be like a special field where if I really do want this to be censored, I'm willing to put like $20 in there, $50, and that would be the utility these guys would get like a separate censorship resistant fee. How are you envisioning this?
Yes, so AUCIL has two utilities. The first phase has the fee that I was talking about, and that is a censorship resistant fee. This can be derived from the tip that the party is giving, or it can be chosen like by the user in a very separate manner, and this can be an entirely separate fee structure. The second utility comes from the auction winning mechanism where that is a protocol generated reward. And both of these are some things that in future work we should look to minimize if that is possible.
Thank you for the talk. So first of all, I learned that it's not called AUCIL, but AUCIL. So that's good to know. The second thing is in the input selection part, is it going to be run on like a single server? So then like one, and then it will like start at some certain point in this slot phase, which then some could have an incentive to like co-locate with it, or would there be any kind of manipulation for an input list maker to like make sure he gets the high value transactions?
So yeah, so one thing I forgot to mention over here was that the input selection algorithm, while I described that as an interactive phase where each party is getting allocated transactions, it's not an online algorithm. Every party has their own mempool. We assume that is common across all parties, and they're all simulating these by themselves. So there is no actual on-chain input selection mechanism that will go on. This is just a suggestion to how validators should behave while picking their inputs for AUCIL. So yeah, to your question, there is no way to manipulate the input selection phase in an adversarial way because yeah, those will be locally computed by the inclusion list, the validators, and not. There is no other way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So two questions. First is I'm a bit puzzled about how the aggregation works. Like just like who is running it, or like just like what machine is actually doing it. So I wonder whether there's some point of failure in this aggregation part. And second, just another just about the selection. You said it's a correlated equilibrium. Is this equilibrium of this selection game separately, or it's kind of like you consider a overall dynamic game thinking about the later steps? Yeah, two questions.
Yeah. So to answer the second question, because it's simple, yes, we do consider it as a dynamic game in which the second phase has already influenced the first phase. For the first question, so there is no single aggregator that is present. All validators that were involved in making the inclusion list or input selection in the first place are all parties that will be participating to aggregate. Every party is computing this bid in AUCIL and then sending it to the block producer. The block producer must choose a bid which is greater than at least n minus theta other values, n minus theta minus 1 bids, and it must show proof that it is greater than n minus theta minus 1. Because theta is the crashes that our protocol follows, this proof is always existent in our scheme. Yeah. So there is no way of introducing another fault in the scheme.